Good morning, everybody. My name is Connor Flanagan. I'm the Director of Education here at the Southampton History Museum, and this morning I'm joined by Joan Baum. She is a resident of Springs and a former literature and writing professor at the City University of New York, and she is currently a freelance book reviewer at WSHU, an NPR station based out of Connecticut. Today she's going to talk about what many regard as one of the greatest books ever written, specifically by an American author. And I'm basically going to turn it over to her. She's going to begin her presentation. And then if anybody has any questions throughout this talk, please feel free to submit them on the buttons at the bottom of the Zoom toolbar. There's a Q&A button and a chat button. Submit all your questions in there as you go. And at the end, I'll come back in and I will ask her any and all questions you guys might have. So enjoy, everybody.
Welcome, and thank you to the Southampton Historical Museum, the Rogers Memorial Library, Connor for hosting this, and Tom Edmonds for being the executive director and inviting me. I've called this talk, How Great is the Great Gatsby? And I thought of it before COVID. And I thought of the talk for a number of reasons. One, celebratory. This past April marked the Great Gatsby's 95th anniversary. And here's a shout out to Kanyo's in Sag Harbor. It also marks 1 week of receiving a copy of The Great Gatsby, the graphic novel, which I'm told is selling like hotcakes. It's also the 100th anniversary of F. Scott Fitzgerald's first novel, This Side of Paradise. It also marks 60 years since Fitzgerald's death in 1940 at the age of 44 of a heart attack in Hollywood. And he did not live to see the success of The Great Gatsby. And so one of the questions I'm going to raise throughout the talk, and I hope with all of you at the end, is it great? He himself didn't think so, but I want your response to that question. So the celebration was a number one reason for my wanting to do the talk. Another was the regional connection of Fitzgerald, both Long Island and East Hampton. Shortly as the 20s began, Fitzgerald, with Zelda, moved to Great Neck, and he stayed there for a couple of years, a short walk from the Long Island Railroad station. He needed to save money. He was already, with Zelda, living too high. And he located in a place in Great Neck that many have thought was the inspiration for West Egg, where Nick Carraway lives. West Egg, Great Neck, different from the tonier East Egg, which people have identified or said is Sands Point, Long Island. There were many people who lived in Great Neck at the time: Groucho Marx, Basil Rathbone, George M. Cohan, Ring Lardner, and also a famous bootlegger by the name of Max Gerlach. But East Hampton was also resonant for my wanting to celebrate the regional connection of Gatsby and our place. East Hampton was where Sarah and Gerald Murphy lived, the subjects of a wonderful book by Calvin Tompkins, which many of you may know, Living Well is the Best Revenge. The Murphys figure in Tender is the Night, 1934 novel, which many say was Fitzgerald's best work. And the characters in the novel, Nick and Nicole Diver, are based in large part on the Murphys. Their granddaughter, Laura Donnelly, lives out here, a fine writer. And also there is Wendy Ferry, who was Sheila Graham's daughter and Fitzgerald's mistress. She lives out here and recently, or not too long ago, published a memoir about her mother. Still, the irony is that The Great Gatsby was written in France, most of it, not on Long Island. The Fitzgeralds had moved to the south of France, where they also saw the Murphys and where they had many friends. A third reason, in addition to celebrating the publication and wanting to honor the regional resonance of the novel, was cultural. This is now 100 years since the beginning of one of the most iconic periods in American cultural history, variously referred to as the Jazz Age, the Roaring Twenties, the Age of the Flappers, and of course, 100 years since the passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. An early collection of stories, not a novel, but long short stories called Mayday, was also published in 1920 and is important for having a number of characters who not only reflect the Jazz Age, but reflect another term that's often used for the period, invented by Gertrude Stein and popularized by Ernest Hemingway, the era of the lost generation. And in fact, the epigraph to The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway is, "You are all a lost generation." A fourth reason for my wanting to do this talk on how great is the Great Gatsby, however, goes straight to the heart of the title of the talk. Is it great? It has appeared for decades on curricula in high schools and colleges. Why? Well, let's be cynical. One of the reasons may be because it's pretty short and teachable for that reason. Another, however, and one that perhaps I will emphasize too strongly, but I think it's part of the reason the book is still in mind, is the irony that the book may not be as well known as some of the many movies made about it. Not too long ago, the New York Times had an interview with the actor John Lithgow, and as they often do with people they interview, what book do you like? What book would you recommend people read? And to Lithgow, the question was, what book would you most like to see turned into a movie? And his answer was wonderful: The Great Gatsby, because there has yet to be a good movie made of the book. So these were some of the reasons why I thought of wanting to talk about The Great Gatsby and to ask whether it is great, and one of the implications, should it be continued on curricula in schools? But then COVID. And two things changed for me. One, COVID has meant a lot of people are doing a lot of reading on Zoom. Book clubs have proliferated, and The Gatsby has already been on many of these lists. And so I began to wonder about what being in a pandemic would cause us to do in reflecting about a book that has been identified as one of our great classics. Incidentally, next year, Gatsby goes into the public domain, so you don't even have to buy it. Anyway, the pandemic is a time to hunker down. I figured it was a time well worth devoting to considering what a classic is. An odd term, by the way, since it usually refers to Greek literature. But the second reason, also having to do with something timely and significant, was my reconsideration of a book that has been called the Great American Classic. And it is about, as it's been said, the American dream, and it's about a question very much on the political horizon: immigration. Gatsby was not an immigrant, but his father probably was, Henry Gatz. And part of the consideration that I'd like us to give, I should say reconsideration, is what did the American dream mean to Fitzgerald, and what does it mean for us now? And is it worth revisiting in the schools because of what we're now experiencing as political divisiveness, East and West, Democrats and Republicans, Americans and not? And so the new topic I'd like to put forth is not just Is the Great Gatsby great? But should we care at a time of widening political and economic division, and time also where curricula have become tribal? One of the ironies of The Great Gatsby was that it wasn't considered great when it was first published in 1925. And at the time of his death in 1940, there were unsold books in warehouses. The irony, again, is complicated by the fact that Fitzgerald's first novel, This Side of Paradise, which was published in 1920, his first book, was a commercial success and somewhat of a critical success and little read today. The book that followed The Great Gatsby, Tender as the Night, 1934, arguably his best as writing and most substantial, also is not read that much. He did write short stories, mainly for the Saturday Evening Post. These sold well, but again, the question of The Great Gatsby, when it was published in 1925, was that it was not sold and did not come into any kind of prominence until perhaps 20 years later. In fact, The Great Gatsby didn't even have the great in its original title, which says a good deal about Zelda's influence and also the influence of editors. Fitzgerald's original thoughts for the title of the book were, and I quote, Trimalchio in West Egg, Trimalchio, under the red, white, and blue, gold-hatted Gatsby, the high-bouncing lover. Who is Trimalchio? A person from the Satyricon by Petronius, 1st century, who became a former slave who became kind of wealthy and by dubious means was considered kind of vulgar or nouveau riche. There's also the question of the epigraph to The Great Gatsby. And if you take a look, you'll see that it's a line from one Thomas Park d'Envilliers, a pen name Fitzgerald used. There is no Thomas Park d'Envilliers, but here's the epigraph. Then wear the gold hat, if that will move her. If you can bounce high, bounce for her too, till she cry, lover, gold-hearted, high-bounding lover, I must have you. Thank goodness for Scribners. Thank goodness for Max Perkins. Thank goodness for editors who get in and convince writers to change titles and also to change text. Let it be said that Fitzgerald, and I want to preface this by saying, if you get a chance, take a look at a facsimile edition of The Great Gatsby. Fitzgerald was moved by his association with Max Perkins. And if you get hold of this facsimile edition, you can see from typescripts alone, and they were hardly all of the editing, how very carefully Fitzgerald took advice, got in there, changed lines, punctuation, rolled around paragraphs. I think surely for writers of you out in the audience, it is a fine example of what an editor can suggest and prompt, but what a good writer as his or her own self-editor can do. So I celebrate the facsimile edition as a way of inspiring all of us to redo our prose. So The Great Gatsby wasn't great until 20 years later. What happened and why? Well, although the book was published in 1925, it looks back, Nick Carraway is looking back a couple of years to 1922, 1923, and despite all the pictures and movies to the contrary, the jazz age was winding down and the Depression was on the move. It was a hardening of divisions. of religious and racial overtones. The Scopes trial, 1925, when a school teacher was arrested for teaching evolution. It was a time when prohibition was still in force and the mafia, certainly in the form of Al Scarface Capone, takes over. And of course, The Great Gatsby resonates with the days of bootlegging and crime. It was also a time, however, and when you reread the book, you begin to appreciate it, I think, anew in terms of today's unrest. It was a time of growing racial tensions. And one of the delights of rereading The Great Gatsby, I guess one of the things I'm going to emphasize is a book is great if it prompts you to start rereading it and you stay with it. One of the great things that I think Fitzgerald did was acknowledge the racial tensions of the time, which were moving with great force. And in fact, if we read carefully, we find that Daisy speaks at one point of her girlhood, our beautiful white girlhood. And I've always found it interesting that critics have commented on her phrase, the white girlhood, as reflective of her liking to dress in white or her referring to her days of innocence. But that book, The Great Gatsby, also has something else very important to say, and I'm sure not played up in the schools or movies. It is clearly the time when the KKK is on the move and white supremacy very much in vogue. And here is a famous quotation from The Great Gatsby. It is Daisy's husband, Tom, talking about a wonderful book called The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man, Goddard. Actually, there was a Lothrop Stoddard, and Fitzgerald knows exactly what he's doing, and in quoting Tom, has him say this: "Civilization's going to pieces." Well, that's a fine book, and everybody ought to read it. The idea is, if we don't look out, the white race will be utterly submerged. It's all scientific stuff. Daisy jumps in and says, "Tom's getting very profound. He reads deep books with long words in them." Tom says, "You're right. It's up to us, who are the dominant race, to watch over all of these other races who will have control of things." Daisy turns to Nick and winks and adds, "We've got to beat them down." Now, Lothrop Stoddard was very much along with Thomas Dixon, who wrote a book in 1905 called The Klansman, mainly responsible for pushing an anti-Black agenda, not only in the country, but on the movie screens. And soon we had Birth of a Nation in 1915, and after that, Gone with the Wind. But it was Birth of a Nation, based on Thomas Dixon's book, The Klansman, which reflected Stoddard's book about the races being divided and scientifically proved to be in order of, well, you'll have to read the book to get more of that. But I did want to say that I was surprised and delighted to find that Fitzgerald not only acknowledged this, but put this front and center as a part of not only Buchanan, but Great Gatsby's reflections and how Nick responds to them. So The Great Gatsby, as I said before, wasn't great when it was first published. What happened? Why did it become so much a part of our literary and cultural life in the 40s? Two reasons. One, during World War II, a number of people had the idea that the soldiers would be comforted by having books to read, shorter books. And there was a whole division called the Armed Services Publications that sent over The Great Gatsby, as well as other books, for servicemen to read. They liked the book a lot, and the sales started to climb noticeably during the war. But then there was also a critic, and his name was Edmund Wilson, and he thought the book was terrific. He wrote about it. He made a special point of getting colleagues to read it. And I think between the Armed Services editions in the 40s and Wilson's championing of the book, it became widely read and widely appreciated, and particularly appreciated as more than a book about the party scene. Certainly by 1951, when another great classic hit the schools and still is there, Catcher in the Rye, The Great Gatsby was certainly popular, because here is Holden Caulfield in Catcher in the Rye, who talks about Gatsby. He was crazy about the book and crazy about old Gatsby, old sport. That killed me. And so through Catcher in the Rye, people had the double whammy of two great novels coming together. However, what the critics did never was able to compete with what the movies began to do. And I want to talk about the movies in a minute, but the terrible irony is that the critics finally got The Great Gatsby right. They saw the book not essentially as a story of parties and the jazz age, but essentially a story of a narrator who is reflecting on the jazz age and the parties. And in fact, they saw, although this still has to be reinforced, they saw The Great Gatsby essentially not as a story of Gatsby, but a story of Nick, a frame story. And I began to think how often we forget that some of our greatest books are frame stories, notably Moby Dick, Call Me Ishmael. It's a first-person narration by Ishmael. And suddenly, like in Gatsby, where the focus goes to Gatsby, the focus goes to Ahab and the chase of the whale, and we forget the larger frame. And this happens often in literature. It happens also in Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And we forget that someone is telling the tale. I'd like to make a pitch for all of these frame stories, and I'd like to make it today when we're so fascinated not only with frame stories and narrators, but narrators who are flawed. And I think The Great Gatsby kind of fits into that nicely. Nick is a flawed narrator, and we as readers come to watch him watching Gatsby and observe what he gets right and perhaps what he doesn't get right. So here's the irony of the critics, as I said, finally making a move to pull out of The Great Gatsby what really defines it as great, a story about narration, observation, criticism of the culture, and yet the movies become powerful in promoting a vision of the book that kind of obviates the narrator. I wanted to show a picture of one famous movie, which I'll talk about, but it got its own cover from Scribner's, no less. There were several movies made of The Great Gatsby, and again, I want to talk about these because the movies replaced the reading of the book, I think, in large part. There was a movie in 1949 with Alan Ladd and Betty Field, MacDonald Carey as Nick. And this movie had a terrific scene of the parties, but the opening was of Nick visiting Gatsby's grave. The best scene was, as someone has said, of Daisy and Jay at the party and looking at his shirts. But it was a good film. It caught on until 1974, when it was replaced by Robert Redford and Mia Farrow's edition, with Sam Waterston as Nick, Bruce Dern as Tom Buchanan, Karen Black as Myrtle. This was produced by David Merrick with a screenplay by Francis Ford Coppola, and it was directed by a Brit. It got mixed reviews. It was, however, a financial success. This movie was popular until it was replaced by Baz Luhrmann's 2013 movie of The Great Gatsby, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Carey Mulligan. The critics had a mixed review of this, but the New Yorker had an interesting review that I had been able to fish up, where they thought it was a pretty good job of indicating an ambivalence in the book, which I want to talk about when I finally critique it as great or not. I wanted to mention that the movie inspired not only people to go back to Gatsby, but it was so powerful for those who loved it that it overwhelmed the book and became its own sensation. It inspired licensing connections, the 1974 version, that is. And I was delighted and entertained to read that Tiffany's and the Plaza Hotel and Brooks Brothers had all kinds of arrangements with the movie for advertising products. In fact, in the movie, it was pointed out that Daisy's bejeweled hand, which I think one sees on the cover of the movie version, was a Tiffany product. And in preparation for the movie, would you believe that there was a package deal at the Trump Hotel for $14,000.99, 3 nights in a suite on Central Park West with a magnum of champagne, cufflinks, tailored suits for men, and a personal note from Ivanka. The movie inspired a Gatsby craze. And again, my comment is going to be a Gatsby craze for the movie and for all the associations with it, rather than for the book. There was even a Nintendo video game in 1987 called Find Gatsby. It's the Roaring Twenties and troubles in store for Nick Carraway. It's hard to enjoy a party when you're being chased by wacky waiters, ditzy drinkers, crazy dancers. Now you have to find Gatsby, the mysterious man you saw disappear on the hillside. Or did he? There were also musicals, a glittering all-female Rockette-style Japanese review. Garrison Keillor hosted an all-day reading of the book, but then in a wonderful move, which alas, I was unable to participate in, there was a reading in New York by the Elevator Repair Company, a wonderful theatrical group, called simply GATS, 7-hour theatrical, which took place in the Village and at the Public Theater at $140 a ticket, but which was a great critical success. And why it was that it restored faith in what is at the heart of Gatsby's greatness, and that is F. Scott Fitzgerald's language. So coming back to my original question, do we think that The Great Gatsby is great, not just because of the language, but because of what it says, said then, says to us now about the American dream? Let me begin first as a teaser to answering the question, and I do want to hear from all of you, that a critic whose writing I admire, Catherine Schultz, wrote a wonderful essay, which you ought to Google, called Why I Despise the Great Gatsby. And she's very clear about all the things that are wrong with it. However, she's read it 5 times and probably by now more. And that's one of the great ironies of the book. It is flawed. In fact, as I said, Fitzgerald himself acknowledged the flaws. He didn't think it was great. He did think Tender as the Night was great. But he saw that he was kind of almost bored with Gatsby and Daisy. There's very little dialogue between them in the book, and he couldn't really relate to them. So even though he himself acknowledged what was wrong, and the critics certainly pick on the fact that it's too obvious with symbols, you know, the eyes, all the elements of fiction which are kind of underdone or overdone, still the book has somehow risen to a prominence and a love despite all that. And again, I think it's rare that someone says, no, this is a flawed novel, but it is great. I think one of the reasons is the language, which I am willing to say, when you read it, you have to read it out loud, and it restores a sense of what good prose is. And like poetry, it is, as the Elevator Repair Company's theatrical performance proved, compellingly beautiful. I'd like to read something from the novel very briefly. I can find my copy here, because it is very much something that is, whoops, I think I lost this here. Very much something that we admire when we talk about the Americanness of the novel. Toward the end, Nick Carraway, who began the novel, by the way, saying that his father had told him not to be so quick to criticize other people because they didn't have his own privileged background. But Nick does criticize. He criticizes Tom Buchanan. He criticizes Jordan Baker as incredibly dishonest. And he criticizes Gatsby, but he comes to admire him as well. He sees the difference between Gatsby and people like the Buchanans who are careless with life. But he also sees something else in the book, and that's what I wanted to read, and that I thought made an interesting, significant statement about our own trying to define our country today. What is American? And one of the great myths of our country has been go west, expand. Gatsby is about people who came from the West and came east and thought that they were entering a part of America that was crucial culturally, intellectually, geographically, but then did not make them happy. And Nick, toward the end, as I said, he's now reflecting, Gatsby is dead. He's thinking about the Middle West, and he says, after Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. So when the blue smoke of brittle leaves was in the air, and the wind blew the wet laundry stiff off the line, I decided to come back home. That is a glorious piece of prose. It has a rhythm that just kind of moves you across the page, across the country. And it's a haunting sense of not quite knowing what is American anymore. The myths you bought into and what you see before you now. The East destroyed things for Nick because of Gatsby. But he also recognized that going home, going to the West, going home to the history of the country was also false in the sense of nostalgic. He notes that. And I think one of the reasons the book is great is that it's unresolving in its look at what the country was then, and I think what it is now. It calls up all kinds of wonderful inquiries about what it means to be American, what it means to have the American dream, for whom the dream is, who are the dreamers. And I don't know how often this is addressed in the schools, how often it's addressed by book clubs. But essentially, any book is great, as I said before, in my opinion, that makes you want to reread it and that doesn't have easy answers. I think one of the most remarkable things about The Great Gatsby, and maybe that's also part of the mystery that I celebrate as great, is that it's not easy to say what it's about. As I said, it was the story basically of a narrator, and we're invited in as narrators and observers also about what it meant to have great dreams, to see the green light. And again, one of the famous lines from the book. This is Nick. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, and it just breaks off. He doesn't know how to conclude. Oh, by the way, before I forget, I mentioned early on that I admired greatly Fitzgerald's love of editing and his skill at doing so. That famous line that I just read, Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future. Originally, if you check the facsimile edition, it's orgiastic future. And he changed it to orgastic, orgasmic. They're the same word. And that's a very critical shift. Read it, think about it. But of course, the most mysterious and explicated to no resolution line of the entire book is its last. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. What is the past? Where does it reside? How much part of the American cultural history did Nick feel himself attuned to as he looked at the past through Gatsby? So I would like to leave this at this point and give people a chance to comment and go back to my original question of how great is The Great Gatsby. I've certainly given my own indications, and I hope the primary one of the language of the book. And again, my take on it, that it does not open itself to easy, clear, emphatic interpretation, but calls us back, almost the way Nick feels called back to the West, his home, but recognizing that he cannot be nostalgic. So thank you very much for listening to this kind of free-ranging, free association take on The Great Gatsby, why I wanted to revisit it, and why I thought, particularly at this time of COVID, of racial unrest, of political division, a book that attempts to move toward our history and our inheritance does belong back in the schools before even our changing demographic student body. Thank you.
That was fantastic, Joan. That was really great. Normally this would end with like some clapping, things like that, but you sort of lose that on the Zoom calls.
Well, I
But thank
didn't
you.
deserve it, but go ahead.
um, but we have a few questions already. But if anybody else listening does have questions, please submit them. If you hit the chat button, you can type them in there, and there should also be a button you might see that says Q&A. You can click that and submit your questions that way. But the first question we have here, it says, "Do you see any parallels in the book to today's first family?"
Oh, that's a tough question to answer because it will prompt political statement and partisan review, and I should not do that. Other than striving, depends how you want to define that green light at the end of the dock. No, I'm going to not answer the question because one, I think it's too loaded. And two, I haven't reflected on that before. But I would say just this. I would be surprised if anyone in the first family read the book.
I agree.
Probably saw the movies.
And then we also have Penny from Rogers Memorial Library said, "Thank you, Joan, for a wonderful talk. And now I'm going to reread this book." I imagine they probably have it there at the library. So if anyone's interested, you might be able to check it out yourself if you don't already own it.
And again, as I said, I wanted to give a shout out to Canyo's in Sag Harbor. They, I'm sure, not only have the book, but they just got in. I'll hold it up again. It's really pretty good. The graphic novel, although the cover is more movies than book, for sure.
And then also Tom Edmonds, director here at the Southampton History Museum, said, "Thanks for the great book party, Joan." And then we have a few other questions coming in. Let's see. Is the message that in these times, which should remain idealistic, not to give up on pursuit of the, quote, green light?
Good question. Let me answer it this way, yes and no. Yes, particularly as we move on from innocence to experience, we should keep a green light. But like Nick, we should be, or I should say, unlike Nick, we should be even more critical when we look at that green light through different colored glasses. The green light probably went out for many people as the age of experience and cynicism took over. So it's a nice balancing act. But again, I think Nick, although he should have been a little more critical of those around him, did exercise a judgment that took the green light and put it in proper perspective for himself. And that's hard to do. Particularly in these tough times, we do get nostalgic. We do think of home, as I said before. And that sentimentality, which is different from sentiment, can be very dangerous. So I guess one of the, again, I don't want to sound like I'm making a moral and getting a fortune cookie conclusion to the book, but I think the more we read the book, which itself makes it great, wanting to reread it, the more we see things in it that we have never seen before. It's a darker book than I had thought when I first read it, and probably when I reread it again, like Catherine Schultz, for the 6th or 7th time, it will get even darker. But I think it gets us to be reflective on what it means to have a green light.
I think with this and any real art piece, the longer it exists, the more you look at it, they always get bigger. Just
well, that's beautifully put, more succinctly than I had put it. But as a teacher, my sense of looking at literature and wanting to put it forth again answered a very simple question. Would I ever want to reread this poem, this novel, this play? And if the answer is yes, even though I may become more critical or take a different perspective, that in itself is valuable, And I'll say this, and I hope I don't hurt feelings of J.D. Salinger fans, but I don't think Catcher in the Rye stands up. I would not be unhappy to have it finally removed from curricula. It does sadden me to think that The Great Gatsby may still be on there, but not really read or addressed.
I know in my high school we had two different classes for literature, and my class we read Catcher in the Rye, and the other class read The Great Gatsby.
Oh,
Yeah, so we were reading
right.
both. This was at Mercy High School in Riverhead, but yeah, so I didn't read Great Gatsby in high school or anything, but in high school I think everybody sort of has that idea where half the class doesn't really read it and the other half kind of reads it. So depending on
Well,
the teacher.
again, I go back to a point I made earlier, and I hope I'm not, kind of flailing about here. But we think, at least of the public schools, the new changing demographic of the country, not white. What should they think about The Great Gatsby? As I said before, curriculas are becoming tribal. Latinos reading Latino literature, Blacks reading Black literature. And I would say that many would say this Great Gatsby coming out of the 20s, out of Fitzgerald, out of East Hampton, something that has nothing to do with them, their ethnicity and class. But I think, again, as I said, rereading it and seeing what Fitzgerald's take on the rising KKK movement in the country is wonderful. And I think the perspective that Nick takes on that as well, recognizing the Buchanans, the kind of people they are, not just careless, but racist and dangerous, that there is enough in there to keep it on the center curriculum stage for those who feel that this is not representative of their culture or their heritage. And as again, I come back to the idea that this is a great American novel in a way that we often don't appreciate.
Let's see, we have some more people saying that is a great talk, very interesting. You've definitely inspired, I think, probably our whole attendance today to reread the book. And we have someone else saying, just out of curiosity, which of the three movie versions is your favorite?
Which of the three movie versions is my favorite?
Yeah.
I think, for an odd reason, the version with Sam Waterston as Nick, and that would be the Redford, because I came to appreciate the book not so much as who was playing Gatsby or who Gatsby was, but who was playing Nick, and to identify with that. By the way, as long as I'm making a pitch for looking at books where there are narrators framing the story that somehow get forgotten, reread Moby Dick. It is, and very much so, like Gatsby, I can pull out passages of prose, passages that are so beautiful in a rhythmic way that, as exemplary of American writing, fine prose writing, it is a great book. And again, to the writers out there, take a look at the facsimile edition and see the amount of editing that Fitzgerald did. I mean, you read passages, the women at the parties floating in diaphanous, gowns in and out. This is glorious prose. It seems so easy. And at what a cost he wrote that ease. That makes a book great too. And you respond to it. And I hope not just the movies, but I'd love to see, hello, Canyo's a shout out. How about doing a reading of The Great Gatsby? And how about doing it in time for another celebration coming up?
Yeah, I think everyone's pretty aware of your opinion now on the book. I think we believe that it's a great book. a great story, a great American story. And I want to thank you again on behalf of both the Rogers Memorial Library, the Southampton History Museum for coming here today, giving your talk, and you'll probably get a message from the bookstore from everybody going in to buy that book.
Well, thank you again for hosting this, and I can't see who attended. I apologize for my flubs and for the light and for drifting off camera, but I so enjoyed the opportunity of talking about this wonderful book, which I'm going to read again, and I'll try the graphic novel version. Thank you again.
Thank you. And everybody that came today, please sign up on or go to our website, sign up for a mailing list. Maybe we'll have another one of these talks coming up again soon with Joan. But for now,
Okay, thank you.
have a good day, everybody. Bye.